Welcome to Humanities DC's Humanitini, where happy hour meets the humanities. For those of you in the audience who are not familiar with Humanities DC, we're the Humanities Council for the District of Columbia. HDC aims to enrich the quality of life, foster intellectual stimulation, and promote cross-cultural understanding and appreciation of local history in all neighborhoods of the district through humanities programs and grants. The Humanitini Curator Award is granted with funds from the Washington, D.C. government through the D.C. Commission on the Arts and Humanities Grant Program. Tonight's program, Poetry Animating LGBTQ+ Spaces, has been created and curated by Tyler Frech, a 2021 Humanitini Curator Grant recipient. Tyler is a writer and public humanist living in Washington, D.C. His first full-length book of poetry, He Told Me, was published by Capturing Fire Press in 2019. He has writing in Impossible Archetype, Beach Street Review, and Bending Genres Journal, just to name a few. Tyler is co-creator and baker for Queer Cookies, a poetry series, bake sale, and poetry cookbook celebrating LGBTQ+ poets. You can find more of Tyler's work at tylerhfrench.com and on Instagram at the handle Tyler H. French, or TH French, sorry. Thank you to Tyler and tonight's panelists, Kim Roberts, Taylor Johnston, Malik Thompson, and Reggie Kabico for making this program possible. I would also like to thank all those making tonight's program accessible, and that's Kai Walther, stage manager, ASL interpreters Benny Yamas and JJ Lache, as well as Jane Conkle for providing live captioning. And I know we're all familiar with Zoom, but before we begin today's program, I would like to go over a couple of housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be recorded and made available on HDC's YouTube channel. The chat is open for comments, and please use the Q&A feature for your questions. And now I'll turn the program over to Tyler.
Thank you, Tracy. My name is Tyler Frech. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am a white cis man with short blonde hair that kind of swoops up. I have a blonde beard. I'm wearing a light blue denim button-down shirt, and I have beige walls in the background and an empty black bookcase. It's not normally this kind of sad and stark. I'm moving, so everything's in boxes right now. I want to welcome everyone to this panel tonight, Poetry Animating LGBTQ+ History, Spaces, and Places, a Humanitini event funded by Humanities DC. And because it's a happy hour chat, I invite you to grab your beverage of choice because I still have a lot of talking to do. I'm drinking a bit of seltzer right now and hoping that we can do a little cheers together as we gather in conversation tonight. Tonight, I am tuning in from what is now known as Washington, D.C., on the unceded lands of the Piscataway, Powhatan, Pamunkey, and Anacostan peoples, amongst many other Native communities whose histories have been obscured, altered, or erased. And I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat, to tell us your name, where you're joining from, and what brought you to tonight's panel. Was there a particular panelist that invited you? Was there a set of questions that you were interested in? I hope that the chat can be a lively space throughout this event. So go ahead and say hi in the chat if you're attending. And tonight we'll have ASL interpretation provided by Benny and JJ, who will be swapping out throughout the evening. We'll also have live captioning provided by Jane, and Kai will be our stage manager. Kai will be monitoring the chat and collecting questions throughout, so please feel free to ask your questions as we go along. You don't have to hold on to them until the Q&A section at the end. I am really excited and honored to facilitate a conversation tonight with these incredible panelists, Kim Roberts, Malik Thompson, Reggie Kabico, and Taylor Johnston. As a queer poet and organizer myself, I am curious and motivated by the questions of how contemporary poets are documenting, articulating, and complicating LGBTQ plus identity and experiences. How these poets and their audiences come together in the context of rapidly disappearing queer-centered spaces, and how contemporary poets relate to their queer poetic forebearers in history, the places and spaces of DC. Tonight, we'll start with 2 panelists at a time to get some more in-depth conversation between the two, and then we'll move to a full group discussion, and we'll close out the evening with questions from all of y'all, all the attendees. And please share your thoughts in the chat as we go along. We have this conversation so that we can surface all of the information that we all share, that we can create new knowledge together, and I hope that you'll be participants in that. I want to welcome into the space Kim Roberts and Malik Thompson, our first 2 panelists. If Kim and Malik could turn on their cameras while I introduce them with their bios. So Kim Roberts is the editor of the anthology By Broad Potomac Shore, Great Poems from the Early Days of Our Nation's Capital. This book was selected to represent Washington, D.C. in the Route 1 Reads program, a multi-state initiative of the Centers of the Book. And Kim is also the author of A Literary Guide to Washington, D.C., Walking in the Footsteps of American Writers from Francis Scott Key to Zora Neale Hurston. Kim also has written 5 books of poetry, the most recent of which is titled The Scientific Method. And you can find more of Kim's work at kimroberts.org. Awesome, Kim put in the chat. Thank you, Kim. We're also welcoming to the conversation Malik Thompson. Malik is a Black queer man proud to be from DC, a bookseller, anime fanatic, and workshop facilitator. Malik has worked with Split This Rock, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Moonlit DC as a workshop facilitator. And outright co-chair, that's right, Marlena, I see you in the chat. Marlena and Malik just got off of an incredible weekend of organizing so many different panels and conversations that are critical to holding these queer literary spaces. So I hope we get to dive into that more. But back to Malik's bio. Malik also organized the Poets in Protest poetry series at the Black queer-owned bookstore, Loyalty Bookstores. Malik's work can be found inside of Split This Rock's poetry database, as well as the mixed media journal, Voicemail Poems. A Tin House Workshop attendee, you can find Malik's thoughts on literature via his Instagram account at Negro Literati. So welcome, Kim and Malik. I am so excited to have y'all here tonight. And I wanted to start the first part of this conversation setting some context where we can talk about poetic forebearers, the movements and spaces and communities that play a part in informing the contemporary poetry and queer poetry landscapes and spaces in DC. I think with all of the work and research that you've done, Kim, to look at this history, could you give us an overview of a couple of flashpoints in the literary history of DC, where you see poetry articulating LGBTQ plus identities? And I know it's a lot of ground to cover, but what are a couple of nuggets that you want people to know as we enter into this conversation?
Thank you so much, Tyler. It's such an honor to be here with this eminent group. Once again, my name is Kim Roberts. I am a middle-aged, cis white woman with short hair that is equal parts brown and gray now, wearing glasses, sitting in my studio with bookcases behind me. I'm wearing a bright pink t-shirt. So yes, your question. Yeah, I would love to highlight a few points of DC queer history that I think everyone should know. And of course, you can't start a conversation about queer writers of DC without Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman moved to DC in 1863 during the Civil War. It was a time of just a huge population explosion for the city, and also a major expansion of the federal workforce. And Whitman did work as a clerk for the federal government. He also famously volunteered in Civil War hospitals. During his time period, we didn't have words to express what homosexuality was. So it makes it a little harder to talk about, but he did have a community of other literary federal clerks that he, a community that he was part of, some of whom were queer and some of whom were not. The other person who I'd love to mention is a hero of mine, Natalie Clifford Barney. She lived in DC in the 1880s, beginning around age 10. And so she was here for some very formative years. Her mother was a prominent painter who had a studio in their home. She was a well-to-do socialite, and that sort of provided a model for Natalie Clifford Barney that she would then use in later years in her life. She's most famous for her Paris salons that she hosted for over 60 years. I wish she was more famous for her poetry. Unfortunately, a lot of it was written in French. But I think her poems should be better known. They're terrific. And in 1900, she published some portrait sonnets of women, becoming the first woman poet to write openly about lesbian love since Sappho. I also cannot help but mention Rose Elizabeth Cleveland. She moved to DC in 1885 to serve as First Lady for her bachelor older brother, President Grover Cleveland. So she is the only known lesbian First Lady in the White House. She wrote poems, essays, a novel. She translated literature from Latin to English. In 1910, she moved to Italy with her lover, and she unfortunately died 8 years later in the influenza epidemic while she was volunteering as a nurse during World War I. Then the final group that, of course, I must mention is the Harlem Renaissance group. Because of the name of the Harlem Renaissance, we tend to think that it only happened in New York City. But there's actually a very strong argument to be made that the Harlem Renaissance started in DC. And of course, it was a movement that was happening simultaneously in several cities. But it was the first literary movement that was dominated by queer writers. Some of those writers who lived in DC include Langston Hughes, Alain Locke, Angela Weld Grimke, Alice Dunbar Nelson, Richard Bruce Nugent, and Zora Neale Hurston. It's an incredible group.
Great, thank you for giving us some nuggets. There's so much more I know to dig in to there. I'm wondering if we could bring some poetry into the space, if you wouldn't mind sharing those two poems with us. Yeah.
I would love to do that. So both of these poems are in public domain. So why don't I go ahead and copy them into the chat as I read them. So the first one that I wanted to read is by Angelina Weld Grimke. I'm reading two poems from my anthology by Broad Potomac's Shore. And this one is very, very short, but I just love it. Angelina Weld Grimke was, of course, part of that Harlem Renaissance group. And her poem is called The Want of You. A hint of gold where the moon will be. Through the flocking clouds, just a star or two. Leaf sounds soft and wet and hushed, and oh, the crying want of you. And then the second one that I want to read, again, very short poem, also in public domain. I am going to paste it here. Oops, there we go. So this is called How Write the Beat of Love. And this was written by Natalie, Clifford, Barney. How write the beat of love, the very throb, the rhythm of our veins' deep eloquence. How fix that darkness-rending final sob, that perfect swoon of each united sense. The full-sailed rising of your body's sweep, adrift and safe on joy's last tidal wave, will toss you on the silver sands of sleep, forgetful of the ecstasy you gave. Your breath ebbs restful as the falling tide, a sea becalmed. Lay me in valleyed part of breasts, whose undulating crests subside. Ah, how they marked the high beats of your heart.
Oof, that's a hot poem, we'll just say.
That's what I think, yes.
Yeah, thank you for bringing poetry into the space and bringing these two poems and giving us some nuggets. And it's actually so interesting kind of seeing Angela Weld Grimke's poem and seeing in it, there's not a poem I was familiar with, actually a lot of alignment with our other panelists on the screen, Malik Thompson's poetry. I'm seeing so much there with your poem Foliage, Malik. That's just incredible. So I want to bring Malik into the space to talk about some of the more recent history to kind of bring us up to speed around the last decade or so of what been going on in DC literary queer spaces. And if there's anything kind of before that, Malik, that you want to touch on too, feel free to go back further in time.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I'm at the bookstore, so excuse the background. My name is Malik. I am a Black queer man, brown skin, no hair, brown burgundy hat on. Yeah, so I'm 26 years old, newly 26. My birthday was August 16th. And yeah, I can speak to my experiences again in the last decade of like orbiting around and within the poetry landscape in DC and specifically the queer poetry landscape. Yeah, so my personal exposure to poetry outside of school came through the DC Youth Slam team, who was a part of the organization Split This Rocks youth programming, and Sarah Browning, the co-founder and ED for a very long time, is here. So much love to you, Sarah, and creating space for poets and especially queer poets to grow and thrive in the city. And you know, the DC Youth Slam team was a spoken word team, and they won the Brave New Voices competition, the youth competition. Eventually, I think it was 2016 or 2015. I can't remember the year. But that was a major, I think, shift in the ways in which poetry, especially among youth, was considered in DC. And a lot of the poets on the team when I was a young kid, when I was a teenager, were also queer. So that was like really inspiring to see and like watch people, you know, who were my contemporaries, like have space and like have public space to openly speak about their identities, their queer sexualities. So immensely grateful for Split This Rock and the poets from the team at that time. So along with that, you know, Reggie Kabico, who is here today as a panelist and will be speaking later, is honestly owed a great deal for creating like queer poetry spaces in the city. You know, there was like Sparkle, the open mic that I think ran for a decade, right, Tyler? It was a decade. Yeah, it was hosted at the Busboys and Poets 14th and U Street location or 14th and B Street location. And like that did so much to help build community among queer writers, not just poets, but writers in general, to have like a nice space where, you know, queer people can congregate around their shared love of literature and their writing of it. Um, trying to think what else. Capturing Fire, you know, the Capturing Fire slam that happens every summer. With Tyler, you know, you're a big part of that, and so many other Chris Thomas, Danielle Reed, which is funny because, you know, Tyler and like Chris and Danielle were all people, Reggie included, who I sort of witnessed, you know, as a youngster, as like my elders, and you all still are my elders, but I feel closer to you all in my like adulthood than I did then. So it's interesting for me personally, to now sort of be more in community with you all in the sense that I have autonomy over my life. But yeah, you know, and then like generally just the poetry landscape in DC, I think doesn't get enough credit, because there's, you know, people like Elizabeth Acevedo, Clint Smith, Pages Matam, other folks who played a huge part in developing and cultivating the landscape here, who went on to become highly successful authors, you know, within poetry, outside of poetry in their own right. And even though, to my knowledge, none of those people are queer, they still played a role in like helping to shape the community. And, you know, like straight folks will give y'all credit every now and then. Sometimes you're worthy. But yeah, that's really all I have to say. Just like they're, you know, and Taylor Johnston, who's on the call as well, is like one of the people who's gaining, who's a personal friend of mine, but also like climbing the rungs of the literary landscape, you know, and gaining more success within that. Like, congratulations, Taylor, for your first book, Inheritance. You can buy it from Loyalty, where I'm currently at, or Bookshop, or whatever. But yeah, the book is amazing. But yeah, that's all I really have to say. There's just a lot of richness here, like in the distant past and the recent past, and it really speaks to the something special, right, about who and what the city draws in terms of like the poetry landscape.
I'm struck by a piece of what you said, Malik, too, around this kind of public affirmation of identity, or public spaces to share these things. To have a queer open mic in a major restaurant and people can come in and out. And I'm wondering, Kim, if you might give us a sense of what these spaces historically might have looked like at these different points, where kind of being public in this way might not have been an option. How was community built without there being the Busboys and Poets, the DC Center, these spaces where you could say this is a queer-centered space?
Well, so in the city's early history, that was done through salons in private homes and in private membership clubs, some of which were also in people's homes. So it was done primarily in private spaces rather than being out in public. And that created safe spaces, but of course that meant that you had to know someone in order to know enough to ask about it, or to get permission to join, which meant that there would always be people who were isolated. I think it's crucial to have some public spaces for people to feel welcomed in.
Definitely. I feel that so much, in that my entry into this space was with Reggie, was with the DC Center. My first open mic that I featured, I think, was a Sparkle event. And that ruined me for all other open mics that weren't queer specific. There are things that people get that I wouldn't have to explain in Sparkle versus a non-queer open mic. And I'm just looking at time. There's so many directions I want this conversation to go, but I want to bring in the other two panelists too. But before we do that, Malik, could you just book in this conversation with the poem that you brought to share with us?
So the poem I wanted to share is by Lucille Clifton, who, again, to my knowledge, isn't queer, but I think wrote in really subversive ways about sexuality. She's one of those people I would consider queer in spirit based on her poetry. But her poem Brothers is magnificent. It's a poem in 8 parts, and if you haven't read it yet, we'll drop a link in the chat on the Poetry Foundation's website. But I'm just going to read the first stanza or canto of the poem for us here today. Let's find it. Okay. So this is Brothers by Lucille Clifton. Being a conversation in 8 poems between an aged Lucifer and God, though only Lucifer is heard, the time is long after. 1. Invitation. Come, coil with me here in creation's bed, among the twigs and ribbons of the past. I have grown old remembering the garden, the hum of the great cats moving into language, the sweet fume of the man's rib as it rose up and began to walk. It was all glory then, the winged creatures leaping like angels, the oceans claiming their own. Let us rest here a time like 2 old brothers who watched it happen and wondered what it meant. Oh, and the thing I forgot to mention is that Lucille Clifton lived in DC actually from 1960 to 1971. So she was here for 11 years, which I think is also super significant and contributes like deeply to the city's like poetic history.
Great, thank you for sharing that poem with us, Malik. I'm also seeing in the chat some other kind of nuggets to rise up. The Coffee House in the 80s from Christopher Prince and DC Space, and Taylor chiming in with in a Cali Coffee House. So maybe we'll get to that in the next little bit of time. But I'm going to ask Malik and Kim to turn off their cameras. They will be back later. So thank you for setting some context for us and giving us some nuggets. And I want to now welcome into the conversation Reggie Kabico and Taylor Johnston. So if y'all could turn on your cameras, and I'm going to read your bios. So Reggie Kabico is the first Asian American and queer poet to win the Nuyorican Poets Cafe Grand Slam. He has appeared in HPO's Deaf Poetry Jam, TEDx Talk, and NPR's Snap Judgment. He received a New York Innovative Theater Award for his work with the New York Neo-Futurists production of Too Much Light Makes the Baby Go Blind. He produces Capturing Fire Festival and Press, has been on faculty at Kundiman, BAMP Spoken Word Arts, and NYU's Asian Pacific Studies Artist in Residence. Reggie is also a founding board member of Split This Rock and a 2019 Le Maison Baldwin Fellowship recipient. Also welcoming into the space Taylor Johnston, an artist from Washington, D.C. They're the author of Inheritance by Alice James Books, published in 2020, winner of the 2021 Nora Farber First Book Award from the Poetry Society of America. Their work appears in the Paris Review, The Baffler, Scallywag, and elsewhere. Johnston is also a Cave Canem Graduate Fellow and recipient of the 2017 Larry Neal Writers Award from the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities and the 2021 Judith A. Markowitz Award for Emerging Writers from Lando Literary. So welcome, Taylor and Reggie.
Hey, Tyler. Hey, Taylor.
Hey, Reggie. Hey, Tyler.
So maybe before we get into present, are there any other nuggets, people, places from kind of historical DC or more contemporary literary history that you two want to make sure are part of the conversation?
Yeah, I can speak to some of that. I think, well, maybe Reggie's gonna bring up Essex Hemphill, but the Enoch Alley Coffee House in the 80s, which actually has a documentary coming out, going to be screened on the 21st. It's Saturday, and I can find a link and put in a chat called Fierceness Served, about the kind of multi-artistic space that emerged in that coffee house, and Essex Hemphill, Michelle Parkinson being 2 prominent figures of that movement. And my personal history, I mean, Reggie Kabico is very instrumental in me as a poet and as a young poet. I guess 15 years ago now is when I met Reggie, and I would say that he really helped me start my life as a writer and thinker, and saw something in me. So I always try to say this. I'm not trying to embarrass you, Reggie, or put you on the spot or anything, but I always try to say this in public, especially when you're around, Reggie, that I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you. So thank you so much for seeing something in me, when I was 15. And yeah, I love you forever, for real. Yeah. So that's a big dude right there, Reggie Kabico, you know what I mean? Yeah.
I'm just gonna cry right now, and I haven't even finished my gin and tonic. But well, snap it up for Taylor and to Kim and to Tyler and to Malik. I'm just gonna dive in and just say, my roots are in Washington, D.C., but not as a poet. I left here in '88 to go to New York to do theater. And so it's only after I graduated that I started to write poetry. I do want to say that while I was in New York, I didn't want to act anymore because I saw how racist and stereotypical the whole industry is towards a young brown Asian actor. And so at that time in the 1990s, the multicultural literature boom was the only thing that was giving me hope. And Essex Hempel was performing at CUNY, New York, and I went to his poetry reading, and I was really amazed by his presence, but also his delivery was so politically charged. And we're forgetting the other, I would call it a pandemic, the AIDS epidemic. They will call it an epidemic, pandemic, whatever. But Essex Hempel's passion and power, it was political, it was theatrical, it was slam, but not performance poetry slam as we know it. So he was really operating from performance art. And the audacity that he has speaking explicitly about gay eroticism, as well as his own poems, like Family Jewels, which caused an uproar with the DC Commission for the Arts and Humanities. So at the mayor's Marion Barry reading, he read this poem, and the DC Commission said, please don't read this poem or take the word corruption out. The mayor's there and it might be a little awkward or embarrassing. And so he says, okay, I'm not going to read it. And then he reads the poem. And so that kind of audacity to be able to be queer, to speak of being HIV positive, living with AIDS. I mean, that was just powerful stuff. And that formed a lot of my poetry. So I owe a lot to Essex Hempel. He would be around maybe 63 today if he was alive. And I really do wonder where we would be if we didn't lose incredible poets during the AIDS crisis, right? And so I am just a young poet in my 20s, just trying to find other gay poets or Asian poets or anyone that would be out there to connect with, because everyone is either dying or closeted. And so it has always been a mission of mine to gather queer poets, so we can speak candidly and without fear. And so coming to Washington, D.C. in 2006 and meeting Sarah Browning, who is, I want to gather all of these fantastic poets together in DC. Let's make it happen. I'm like, all right, I'm in, Sarah. And so I really do feel that this whole community gathering in DC inspired Capturing Fire, because I think in the second festival, Capturing Fire was a way to reinvigorate the slam community in DC as it was dying out. But it was also a way to gather queer poets and build what was known as the Beltway Poetry Slam, which gave a venue for Elizabeth Acevedo and Clint Smith and all of these poets that Malik was talking about. So if there's anything, and I will stop here. If there's anything, it was really the proliferation of poetry slam culture because that I was interested in. So whether that's DC Youth Slam or a queer open mic or an adult slam, to me that it was that culture that I was mostly interested in, and really blown away by young poets like Taylor Johnston and Safia El Hilo, and just building that community that while I was living in New York for 18 years, it was very rare that DC invited me or that to perform. So I feel that starting in 2006, the doors became generous and magnanimous. Split This Rock, Busboys and Poets, the Sparkle series started at Busboys and Poets. So I feel that this is where we are now. And I think that we're reaping so much privilege in queer community and also in queer allies. I just don't think that we would be here without what has happened and a lot of the rebuilding that has happened, and to the incredible work that Kim Roberts was doing archiving poets from DC, and the emphasis wasn't necessarily queer, but definitely creating queer issues in Beltway poetry. So I could keep going, but I'm just going to stop right there.
Thank you, Reggie. I'm curious about DC as a place too, and how it shows up in both of your poetry, Taylor and Reggie. And I'm wondering, maybe we can start with Taylor. How does the city, DC, show up in your poetry or inspire it or inform it or move through it? And maybe I'm curious, has that shifted since you moved from DC?
Yeah. DC is very much it's very much its own character, you know what I mean? I kind of let the city move through me as I would like language, you know. Most of the poems in the book were written walking, let's say, Georgia Avenue, 7th Street, 14th Street, you know, all the way up and down, riding the buses, riding the X2, riding the 70, riding some of the S buses. So there's very much a kinetic sense of the city within my body and thus within my language. And, you know, if you're from there, you know how easy it is to just kind of walk and put the city in your body in a certain way. And I think a lot of the poems came from that idea of motion and trying to take the city in through my feet and thus through my ears too. And a lot of it, you know, a lot of my poems kind of deal with this liberating kinetic syntax of go-go music that is DC's Black indigenous sound. So yeah, I mean, I think anytime I speak about DC, it's a privilege to be so close to this place. You know what I mean? It's a really special place. Lucille Clifton says that like there's some places that have this populated air, and DC is very much in that way in terms of Black history and literary history and queer literary history in particular. Not only just seeing the markers, but just catching the vibe of the city. There's a deep oral culture. You can kind of be on the street talking to people and learn a lot about yourself and about where you are just by walking around, which is how I came into knowledge as a young person. Yeah, so the city is very much, it's everything. It's everything to me. It's still where I work out from. And moving away, I mean, I lived in Paris, I live in New Orleans, and now I live in Charlottesville, so I'm a little bit closer now in Virginia. But I think one thing that being away, I think, did was understand that the level of surveillance that Black people are under in the city and the level of you know, just the constant threat to the space that Black people can take up in the city is always under attack in that place. And so I really saw that being away from it. Yeah.
I'm wondering, Taylor, if you might share one of those poems.
Yeah, I was gonna read a poem of mine. Maybe I still will, but I kind of wanted to read this poem from Kane, Jean Toomer, because I know Jean Toomer was born in D.C. And he lived on Harvard Street. Is that right? Kim probably would know more, but he lived on Harvard Street, I believe.
He did indeed live on Harvard Street.
Yep, it was like 14th and Harvard, something like that. So I'm gonna read this poem by Jean Toomer that's called 7th Street. It's from Kane. Money burns the pocket, pocket hurts. Bootleggers in silken shirts, balloons zooming, Cadillacs whizzing down the streetcar tracks. 7th Street is a bastard of prohibition and the war, a crude bone, soft skin wedge of nigger life breathing its loafer air, jazz songs and love, thrusting unconscious rhythms, black reddish blood into the white and whitewashed wood of Washington, stale soggy wood of Washington, wedges rust and soggy wood, split it in two, again, shred it, the sun, wedges are brilliant in the sun, ribbons of wet wood dry and blow away, black reddish blood pouring for crude bones, soft skin life. Who set you flowing? Blood suckers of the war would spin in a frenzy of dizziness if they drank your blood. Prohibition would put a stop to it. Who set you flowing? White and whitewashed disappear in blood. Who set you flowing down the smooth asphalt of 7th Street in shanties, brick office buildings, theaters, drugstores, restaurants, and cabarets, eddying on the corners, swirling like a blood red smoke up where the buzzards fly in heaven. God would not dare to suck black red blood, a nigger God. He would duck his head in shame and call for the judgment day. Who set you flowing? Money burns the pocket, pocket hurts, bootleggers in silken shirts, balloons zooming, Cadillacs whizzing down the streetcar tracks. That's from Kane, Jean Toomer.
Thank you, Taylor.
Yeah. And I'll put a link to my book in the chat too, so you could read that.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about the names of the organizations, open mics, movements that have happened, and how much work it takes to hold those spaces for people, to make those spaces with and for each other. So Reggie, I'm wondering if you might give people a taste of that, how much work it really takes to make Capturing Fire happen, to make even a monthly open mic happen. It's no small feat.
It has aged me. I've lost lots of hair doing it. Actually, I will answer the question, but what I did put in is a link to the Queer Cookie Cookbook, which you could get through loyalty bookstores, of which I had the pleasure of working with Tyler on. It's an incredible book. We're talking about what does it take to gather poets. It takes one person who makes people feel comfortable, who loves creating the platform where people can be themselves. So for me, the fact that anyone can come up to read a poem, regardless of experience, but that you have that open space to do it, and you have a nurturing space to do it, and that there's a host that makes everyone feel comfortable, and that you're in an environment that is friendly, is it takes a lot of work. I think that gathering poets to the Queer Cookie Cookbook is another way of, through publication as well as through open mics. DC does not have a lot of queer presses, and if you consider it, there's not a lot of queer bars, there's not a lot of queer journals. There are some, but it has vanished in this new world, right? And at this point, it's making me want to give a shout out to Tracy and everyone at Humanities DC for supporting this event and funding this event, because we are in the middle of a pandemic and we're trying to figure out who we are as queer poets, and even how do we connect, and even how do we meet other queer people, right? How are we going to do this? So the challenges are hard, but we have things that didn't exist when Split This Rock started. We have a virtual sort of a Zoom culture in order to create space now. And I'm hoping, and I'm gonna try to jumpstart a queer open mic through some new spaces. There's Crazy Aunt Helen's is a new restaurant that opens, and they're really interested in doing queer programming. And that is the first restaurant that is queer focused, that's got a queer bend to it, even though it's open to everyone. So that gives me a little bit of hope as we try to navigate who we are as queer poets, even just trying to find a queer physical space.
So there's some things swirling around for me that I think it might be good to bring in Malik and Kim to back into the conversation. And it really is, I'm thinking about a couple of things. I'm thinking about a conversation with Malik before the panel around kind of investment in the city, making all of these arts programs possible, but then reaching this point of gentrification and hyper gentrification that make them impossible, that make them inaccessible. And I'm thinking, Taylor, to you talking about their surveillance and threat of Black life, and thinking about go-go music and all of that outside of U Street the past couple of years, with people protesting or sending noise complaints about go-go music playing outside. And I don't have a question fully formed, but there seems to be, at least in my kind of motivation to bring everyone together, is how do we can think more broadly than literary spaces, but how do cultural spaces, culture makers, pieces of culture, how are they preserved? How are they documented? What do we need to be paying attention to now to kind of push against this threat of hypergentrification, push against this threat of cultural markers of DC being complained about by people who are moving to the city who don't have connection to it? And how does that interface with your work as poets and organizers? And how might that interface with queerness and other intersecting identities as well? So a big question, but maybe where do you see, each of you, your places in this?
I'll start, if that's okay. I was living in New Orleans for about 3 years, and I came back to DC just in June. And I walked down 14th Street and was so confused and so sad. I remember you said the phrase like the hypergentrification. I think that started probably like 5 years ago. You know what I mean? It really started 15 years ago, and even further back than that. But seeing the way that, for example, the Mission, the homeless shelter on 14th is now turned into an apartment complex called the Mission on 14th. It felt like a joke, you know what I mean? And as somebody who deals with language, I'm looking at that word mission, you know what I mean? So the mission is to displace people, ultimately who can't, afford to live in this place where they're from. And me, for instance, I can't afford to live in DC, even though my ancestors are from there. I'm from there, but it's inaccessible to me. And I think that there's something that language can do to highlight and bring into focus that particular kind of inaccessibility, to make you feel it. And that's what I want to do ultimately. That's where I'm at with my use of language and work as an artist ultimately. Yeah, and I think for me, some of that work will be collaborative and branching a bit more into visual work. But yeah, just trying to visualize and sound out and map out the way that, you know, we can kind of find refuge from this thing that is already taken over. It is already here, you know what I mean? Like, we just have to live within it now. And how can we do that in a liberated way? Yeah.
I wanted to go back to your question about documenting, and because of course that's a lot of what I've been, my work has been around. So I wanted to mention some of the presses in the region that are doing really important work in publishing queer poets. So we should mention, along with Capturing Fire Press, Redbone Press, which has been doing some just incredible work in keeping queer writers of color, their work in print. But I should also mention, Paycock Press brought out Ed Cox's collected poems, even though that's not a specifically gay press. They've been an ally. I would also mention Javal Press, Poetry Mutual. Those are small presses that are run by queer writers. So I think part of this is just sort of remembering what we've got, celebrating what we've got. Also wanted to mention, while we're talking about spaces, DC Space, which was very queer friendly. The Black Cat, which for years hosted Mother Tongue. Solely Soul was an organization that actually brought Reggie Kabico back into the city. So, you know, there are a lot of organizations that I want to make sure we do a shout out to. Oh, Jonah Colson just wrote in the chat comments, Washington Writers Publishing House is very queer friendly. Yeah, so there are spaces where I think these voices are still celebrated. And I did also want to mention, while we're dropping names of important forebears, that part of our history, it does include people like Ed Cox, Owen Dodson, who taught for years at Howard University, Minnie Bruce Pratt, who taught for many years at the University of Maryland, Tim Dugos lived here for a long time. Julie Enzer, who's done such incredible work in bringing lesbian poets back into print. And there are a lot of contemporary authors also that have been a huge influence on me. I would include Cheryl Clark, Venus Thrash, Richard McCann, who taught at American University for a long time. So I mean, I could go on and on with these names, Sunu Chandy, Nikki Hurd, Venus Thrash, who have I forgotten? Francisco Aragon. So I think one of the things that it's really incumbent upon us to do, because of gentrification, because we're losing some of this ground, is to continue to celebrate that history that we have. And there's this incredibly rich history of queer writers in DC.
I'm going to jump in. What I'm going to do is, let's see if I can do this. Talking about documentation, it's unfortunate that a lot of my work was done in the early 90s, and that was before YouTube. That was before you had a smartphone. So I have a lot of stuff on high 8 and VHS. VHS! I'm sure there's a video of me in Blockbuster somewhere, but I do want to just give a shout out that at least for Essex Hemphill's performance work, I'm going to try to put this. I just found a video online of his work with Wason Jones, who's a visual artist and still living. And you could sort of see this performance work, and it's amazing. And I'm grateful to whoever was able to document this, so that way there's a recording of Family Jewels by Essex Temple. It's in the chat, so in your own time, do look at for it. Documentation is so freaking important. And even when I was hosting Sparkle with Daniel Avenue, we actually took a photo. After I asked everyone, let's all come up, let's just take a photo at the end. And so even just photographing it is just so important. It's just going to mean a lot down the road, just to document and to archive the spaces, because open mic spaces are ephemeral. It's not a Netflix series. It just comes and goes. It was a moment that just happened. And bring out your camera, archive it. There's no excuse to not have the works videoed and archived. And I'm hoping that as we progress, I don't think we've really had a chance to really speak candidly as queer poets, and doing the phenomenal work that Malik and Marlena just did with Outright, making sure that we are connected and that we are not alone, even though we are in a pandemic, is incredible and huge. So this panel is just the beginning of what will propel us into the next 30 years. And again, I keep wondering, if as example were alive, how many doors Essex could have opened for other younger queer poets. I feel like we're calibrating ourselves now as defining what queerness means, and opening what it means to be gender nonconformative, incorporating queer disability into what this could look like. And so I'm excited. And this Humanitini only propels the future. So so thank you.
Yeah, I think a lot of things about what was brought up, but what I want to focus on is the significance of community. I think, right, like the reason why like there was disruption within like queer lineage and queer genealogy is because the government really did not give a fuck about like the lives of, you know, the people perishing from AIDS and AIDS related illnesses and, you know, adjacent reasons. And so in that time period, even though there were lots of fatalities, like from the history I've read and witnessed, you know, via documentation, there was a huge significance on rallying together and sharing resources and sharing time and sharing money and sharing food and really giving the care to one another that the government was like unwilling to offer. And so I think as we deal with the beast of hypergentrification that's only going to become exacerbated by, you know, the oncoming and ongoing climate disaster, we really will have to think critically as arts community, as, you know, people outside of arts community, of like, what will it mean to take care of each other in like deep material ways when, you know, when and if we need to, whether that's now, whether that's like tomorrow, whether that's 10 years from now. I think outside of our artwork, outside of what we do with language, or, you know, whatever our mediums are, whether that's we're historians, like we also must think about our civic duty to our fellow human being. Um, so that's something I think about a lot. And I also think that, you know, in what ways can we leverage our power, right? And talking about that, like Tyler, you had this opportunity, to curate this event, and you chose to put the four of us here, and thinking about the significance of putting two people from DC, Taylor and myself, and, you know, two people have deep roots within like DC community, leftist DC community here, is significant. So I think that, yeah, we really need to figure out how to take care of each other and leverage our power, you know, whatever that power, however minuscule that may be, in order to give each other like opportunities, financial or otherwise, to like blossom and grow and have visibility and be able to, you know, pay for a meal or pay our rent. That's it for me. I just think we really need to think deeply about like what it means to ensure the other person has food to eat or a place to sleep or whatever the case may be. Because it's just going to continue to get worse, you know, and we're just going to have to continue to get more creative and scrappy.
Thank you all. I think just we'll hold on to these levers, these different interventions that you've all named for a second. But I also want to hold some space for attendees to ask their questions. And I'm wondering, as attendees are thinking of the questions that they have for panelists, Reggie, could you read Family Jewels for us while we're in that weird space of waiting for people to type in their wonderful questions?
Sure. There are three poems that I wanted to read. I will read Family Jewels. I'm going to put Family Jewels into the chat, so it's accessible. All panelists, all right.
And
So,
while Reggie is reading, everyone, if you just type your questions in, and then we'll move through some of those.
I also want to put in this other poem by Essex Sempill, which is called Black Beans. And so I will read Family Jewels. And this was the one that got controversy with the DC Commission for the Arts and Humanities. And it's really not that controversial, in my opinion, but okay, here we go. And Family Jewels. Family Jewels for Washington, D.C. And before I read this, Essex Sempill has a very contemporary style, but he also likes to put, he mixes his diction with some, how do I say it, like old school classic and modern vernacular. And I love how he plays with that. All right, Family Jewels for Washington, D.C. I live in a town where pretense and bone structure prevail as credentials of status and beauty. A town bewitched by mirrors, horoscopes, and corruption. I intrude on this nightmare, arm outstretched from curbside. I'm not pointing to Zimbabwe. I want a cab to take me to Southeast so I can visit my mother. I'm not ashamed to cross the bridge that takes me there. No matter where I live or what I wear, the cabs speed by. or they suddenly break a few feet away, spewing fumes in my face to serve a fair-skinned fare. I live in a town where everyone is afraid of the dark. I stand my ground, unarmed, facing a mounting disrespect, a diminishing patience, a need for defense. In passing headlights, I appear to be a criminal. I'm a weird-looking motherfucker. Shaggy green hair sprouts all over me. My shoulders hunch and bulge. I growl as blood drips from my glinting fangs. My mother's flowers are wilting while I wait. Our dinner is cold by now. I live in a town where pretense and structure are devices of cruelty. A town bewitched by mirrors, horoscopes, and blood. And I just want to reiterate things about gentrification. And this poem was written in the 80s. And so how this could be relevant, this was before Uber and Lyft, but still relevant. And so that is an Essex sample poem. So please read his poems. If you think you're not brave, if you feel like you're too brave, read his poems.
Thank you, Reggie. And it does feel very present to this conversation. I live in a town where pretense and structure are devices of cruelty. It feels very kind of present to these conversations. So I'm looking at questions that our wonderful stage manager, Kai, has collected throughout the evening. And one really stands out to me, and we've kind of circled around it. But curious how poetry and activism interact and inform each other in DC and in queer spaces. And this can be answered kind of generally or from a historical perspective or from a personal perspective as well. How do poetry and activism inform and interact with each other? And maybe we'll start with Malik this time. And if you have something to say, if not Malik, then you can pass it on to whoever you want to hear.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to say. I think that if a poet chooses to engage in activism, then the activism will inform their work more often than not. Like June Jordan's example, Audre Lorde's an example. You know, two queer people who were both like fairly amazing poets and also activists and chose to incorporate that aspect of their lives into their work. And then you have people who, like Ellen Bass left poetry to, pursue activism, and then returned to poetry later in life. And as far as I know, Ellen Bass, someone correct me, I'm not super well read on Ellen Bass's work, but I'm not sure how much activism is an influence on Ellen Bass's contemporary poems. So I think it's up to the poet. I think it's the poet's decision. Like, I am sort of an activist in really oblique ways, but I will never really write about activism in my poetry, because that's not what the poems want, at least not as of now. Yeah.
I'll jump in really quickly. I think as poets, we can write about whatever we fucking want to write about, right? And I feel like because I come from the poetry slam world, I'm trying to figure out where is the edge for me and where is the danger. And I feel as the queer poets here, there is danger in what we want to say, bluntly and blatantly, because it is not accepted by cultures, right? So I ask myself, where is the danger and where is the risk? And, you know, for me, even if I'm performing a funny poem, there's going to be risk in my sense of humor. And so if there's no danger in the work that you have, then what's really the point? So that doesn't mean that we can't write poems about coffee cups and being at the Arboretum and being in love. But I feel like a lot of my DC poems are about exploration of love. And DC is a romantic place. And I've only written about DC because of Kim Roberts' solicitation for the anthology Full Moon on K Street. And so my poem was about looking at multiple spaces in DC which are romantic, and saying that you're in love with the same gender or of someone gender non-conforming might be a little risque, which is unfortunate, but that is the truth. And so wherever I am with someone that I'm in love with, I'm ignited by the glory of that space with that person. And so if that is another man, then so be it. So that's where I say activism is because I'm interested in exploring danger. And I also feel that as slam poetry, as we pontificate sometimes our words, what do we want to say? What's really important? What do we really want to say right now? And so then so that all poems are political and all poems are activist poems. And as queer poets writing about it, we're taking a risk.
I'm going to jump in and just say, I think that queer poets don't have the choice of being anything other than activist in our poetry and our lives. And I think that we're sort of incumbent upon us to be good literary citizens and to support one another and to help provide opportunities for other poets around us. And I think that in a weird way, because DC is so focused on government and is so, in general, it has not been a poetic place. We've had to make it our own kind of poetic place. And it has been in my experience, it's been a very generous literary community because we sort of come to it with this underdog status. So, I think that how could this not show up in our work? How could it not influence the poetry as well?
Thank y'all. And Taylor, do you have any thoughts around poetry and activism living together in DC?
Oh yeah, I mean, nothing more than what everyone else said. Yeah.
Great. Thank y'all. I'm going to highlight this question, but it was also my kind of closing question. So finding some alignment there. So we kind of talked about these interventions or what we can do as poets, as queer poets, as members of the literary community, that we can pay attention to and really uplift the power of language to name and highlight that documentation and publication are incredibly important vehicles to make sure that these histories and stories are told and held, that we can celebrate the spaces and organization of people that are working to hold all of these spaces to make this gathering possible, and that there's such significance in community, to share resources, to use the levers that we have, to get everyone paid for writing poetry, and being a member of this community, and to support each other through it. So I'm wondering, we have these levers. What is each of your kind of wish or hope for the future of DC's LGBTQ plus literary world, being, presence? What do you hope to see? And it can be a small or as big as you want to name on this call. What is your hope or wish? If we're doing all these interventions and these things are working, what are we going to see?
Well, I can jump in. I think this pandemic has been incredibly isolating for so many people. And my hope is, especially now that we have these variants coming up, that we are able to safely meet in person again, and have these community spaces where we can lift one another up. I have just been feeling so strongly the lack of that kind of community over the past year and a half.
My hope is that we see elementary school children writing about their gender and their queerness, that they feel they can be who they want to be and be the artists that they want to be. My wish is that there is a literary center in DC proper that has a space where people could read from from their own authentic identity, and that we have those spaces that are not commercially censored and or dictated by commercialism or business.
Yeah, I think this is true for like DC's, trans, queer, non-hetero art scene, but like art in general. I think that with the incorporating of non-hetero identity into the capitalist agenda, right, and like sort of sanitizing that, in comparison to what I've witnessed and like seen and read of like art produced by like queer folks in like the 80s and the 90s versus today, it doesn't have that same edge and that same grit. Like there's a different tenor, and like it's understandable because like my life, as a young person who's 26 and like grew up in a very different era than say Reggie or Kim, things were a lot easier. I think like seeing gay people on TV and but I really want that edge to come back. I want that like gritty, nasty, like like I fucked this guy in like the bathroom and the subway, like I want that back. I'm like, where is it? I mean, I write my own stuff that's sort of like edgy and whatever, but I'm just not that demotic in my language. But I'm just like, I want that edginess. I want that grittiness. I want like nasty grinder hookups and poems. I want like semen. I just want that back badly for queer trans artists. I just want our edge back. I feel like the cis hats have really like tamed us or tamed our art. I don't like it.
Yeah, I dig that, Malik. I think that part of that is like the decoupling of art making from any kind of institutionalization. You know what I mean? More things happening in homes and more intergenerational dialogue, such that that edge can kind of be shared in a communal way. And to not be siloed, you know what I mean? I think this, academic or institutional hold that a lot of places have on people's language and such, their poetry really does do that work of sensitizing and taking the edge away. So my hope is that, in addition to the edge coming back, I would love to see things divorced from the sense of institution, and particularly academic institutions. Something that is more intergenerational and not relying upon pedigree or particular pedagogies. Yeah.
Thank you all. I could talk to each of you forever and ever and ever, but I know that we're reaching the end of our time together now. And it's such an honor to be able to have this space with you all and to be in community with you all, because you all are out there doing this work, this important work of making those wishes possible and actual. So I just want to thank you all, Taylor, Malik, Kim, and Reggie, for being here tonight, to sharing what you know, to sharing beautiful poems that are really important to the fabric of poetic life in DC. And I want to make sure that everyone knows where they can reach you, where they can find out more about your work, where they can read your poems. So if y'all could, we'll go in reverse order. Taylor, if you could just give a little plug about where people can find you.
You can find me in Charlottesville, Virginia. You can buy my book called Inheritance, which I really hope you do buy. It came out in 2020, November 2020, Violet James Books. Malik thinks it's good, so it is. And I really hope that, that's one way to support me. This is what I do with my life. You know what I mean? I don't have another job. I write poems and I make art, and this is how I live. And so I hope that you can, find something there and then reach out to me. I have a website, taylorjohnstonpoems.com. I can put all these things in the chat, but that's the best way to get in contact with me. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Taylor. How about you, Reggie?
Oh, well, get the Queer Cookie Cookbook, find an incredible poem about Filipino cookies and deities, or that. But you'll find my work online. You could go to capfireslam.org and see more about capturing fire. But if you type in Reggie Kabico, you will be inundated with a plethora of really, I don't know, experimental, risque shit, whether it be video or online. So do check it out for sure.
Thank you, Reggie. And how about you, Malik? Where can people find your work?
It's kind of scattered. Like you can find some at Split This Rock, you can find some at Voicemail Poems. I have a poem in the Queer Cookies Cookbook. I think those are only 3 poems I have out in the world in like a really public way. But if you follow me at Negro Literati, I'll just drop that handle there in the chat. See what I think about different books. I don't post a lot, honestly, but like I may post in the future. You can see what I already said.
Great. Thank you, Malik. And how about you, Kim?
The easiest way to find out about me and my books and links is from my author website. So it's kimroberts.org. I'm an entire org, just me. And my latest book is this anthology of historic DC poems by Broad Potomac Shore. Yeah, I would also, like Taylor, I would encourage you to help support us by the books. Taylor, I love your book. just by the way. So I want to say to everyone, please buy Taylor's book.
Thank you so much, Kim. That means a lot coming from you. Thank you.
It's gorgeous. I'm going to put my website in the chat. There we go.
Awesome. If everyone listening can give some snaps, some applause, some thanks to the poets, tell us in the chat maybe, because we can't see y'all can only see us, but we're feeling it. We're feeling all of the thanks. Thank you all for being a part of this evening. I also want to extend thanks to Humanities DC for providing the funding that made this event possible from the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities. I want to thank Tracy Mullery for all of the support and organizing, and Andrea Carroll McNeil for stewarding this grant program. If you live in DC and you have an idea for a conversation, apply for this grant. Do it. It's a good amount of money of support to make something like this possible, and these kinds of conversations are necessary. I also want to thank Kai Walther, our stage manager, who's been behind the scenes all the time, for supporting the smooth flow of the event. Kai, could you maybe, I didn't prompt you to do this, but drop your own contact information in the chat, the way that people can reach you. If anyone's looking for event support, looking for a public historian, looking for informal educator and public educator, please reach out to Kai. I also want to thank Benny and JJ for providing ASL interpretation and Jane for captioning the event. If you have any questions or want to get in touch, you can email me at thfrench9@gmail.com, and you can find me at thfrench on Instagram. As Tracy shared at the beginning, Humanities DC is recording this reading, and they will share it out after they've posted it. So please feel free to share this reading with folks who weren't able to make it tonight. And thank you all for being here.